They built more B-24 Liberators than any other American military aircraft in history. 18,482 of them rolled off assembly lines between 1940 and 1945. That is more than the B-17 Flying Fortress, more than the P-51 Mustang, more than any bomber ever produced. The factories at Willow Run, Fort Worth, San Diego, Tulsa, and Dallas pumped them out 24 hours a day, an industrial miracle that employed hundreds of thousands of workers. Henry Ford called it the greatest achievement in mass production since the Model T. The military called it the Liberator, suggesting freedom and victory. The crews who flew it called it something else. The flying coffin, the flying brick, the Widowmaker, because the B-24 had a fatal design flaw that killed thousands of American airmen. It could not take battle damage. When it got hit, it did not limp home like the B-17. It exploded, burned, or broke apart in midair, giving crews seconds to bail out before they died. This is the story of how America's most produced bomber became one of its deadliest, and how the young men trapped inside learned too late that quantity does not equal quality. The B-24 Liberator was born from jealousy and competition. In 1938, Boeing unveiled the B-17 Flying Fortress, and it immediately became the darling of the Army Air Corps. Consolidated Aircraft Corporation, based in San Diego, watched Boeing get all the contracts and all the glory. Consolidated's founder, Reuben Fleet, was a hard-driving businessman who hated being second place. When the Air Corps asked Consolidated to build B-17s under license, Fleet refused. He told them he could design a better bomber. The Air Corps was skeptical, but they gave him a chance. In January 1939, they issued a specification for a new heavy bomber with longer range, higher speed, and greater bomb capacity than the B-17. Fleet assigned the project to Chief Engineer Isaac Ladden. They had 9 months to design, build, and fly a prototype. Most aircraft programs took years. Consolidated had less than a year. Ladden's design team worked around the clock. They started with a radical concept. Instead of the B-17's conventional rounded fuselage, the B-24 would use a deep, slab-sided fuselage that maximized internal volume. The wing would be a high-mounted Davis airfoil, long and thin, with exceptional aerodynamic efficiency. This wing design gave the B-24 incredible range, over 2,000 miles, with a full bomb load. But it also made the aircraft awkward to fly. The high wing meant the landing gear had to be unusually tall, which made the B-24 prone to ground loops and noseovers. Pilots hated the handling characteristics. The B-24 was heavy, sluggish, and difficult to control compared to the B-17. But it had range, and in 1939, range was everything. The XB-24 prototype first flew on December 29, 1939. Test pilots immediately noticed problems. The aircraft was unstable. The controls were heavy. The visibility from the cockpit was poor. The nose-wheel steering was terrible. But the performance numbers looked good on paper. Top speed was 300 miles per hour. Range was 3,000 miles. Service ceiling was 28,000 feet. Bomb load was 8,000 pounds. Expandable to 12,800 pounds. The Army Air Corps ordered 7 pre-production models in 1940, then placed massive production orders as war loomed. By the time Pearl Harbor was bombed in December 1941, Consolidated had orders for thousands of B-24s. The problem was they had not worked out the bugs yet. The production models that started rolling out in 1941 and 1942 were plagued with issues. The hydraulic systems leaked constantly. The electrical systems were unreliable. The turbo superchargers that gave the B-24 its high-altitude performance failed regularly. The bomb bay doors were massive roll-up doors that often jammed. And worst of all, the fuel system was a disaster. The B-24 carried 2,800 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel in self-sealing tanks mounted in the wings and fuselage. But the fuel lines ran through unprotected areas. When the B-24 took battle damage, those fuel lines ruptured. Fuel sprayed everywhere. One tracer round or one piece of hot shrapnel, and the entire aircraft turned into a fireball. The B-17, by contrast, was famously tough. It could absorb tremendous battle damage and still bring its crew home. B-17s returned to base with entire sections of the fuselage blown away, engines shot off, tail sections hanging by cables. The stories of B-17 survival became legendary. The B-24 had no such reputation. When a B-24 got hit hard, it went down fast. The deep fuselage that gave it internal volume also made it structurally weaker than the B-17's circular cross-section. The thin, efficient wing that provided excellent range was also prone to catastrophic failure when damaged. A single flak burst could shear off a wing. A fighter's cannon shells could punch through the fuselage and ignite fuel vapors. B-24 crews learned quickly that their bomber could not take punishment. The worst part was the emergency egress. Getting out of a B-24 in an emergency was nearly impossible. The aircraft had limited exits. The bomb bay had to be clear to use as an escape route, which meant you could not bail out if you were still carrying bombs. The waist gunner positions were cramped. The nose wheel well blocked the lower forward hatch. If the aircraft was spinning or on fire, crew members had seconds to get out before it exploded or hit the ground. Many did not make it. Post-mission reports are filled with accounts of B-24s exploding in mid-air with no parachutes seen. Entire crews were lost in an instant because they could not escape the aircraft before it disintegrated. But the B-24 had one massive advantage. It was easier to mass-produce than the B-17. The slab-sided fuselage used flat panels instead of complex curves. The wing was a simple one-piece structure. The systems, despite being unreliable, were easier to manufacture than the B-17's more complex layout. This made the B-24 perfect for mass production, and mass production was what America needed. In 1942, the United States was building an air force from scratch. Every factory in the country was converted to war production. Consolidated San Diego plant was too small to meet demand, so the government built the largest aircraft factory in the world at Willow Run, Michigan. Henry Ford ran the operation. Willow Run was a mile-long assembly line that churned out one B-24 every 63 minutes at peak production. It was an industrial marvel. Workers who had never built an aircraft before were suddenly assembling the most complex bomber in the world. Quality control was a nightmare. The B-24s coming off the Willow Run line were not the same as the ones built in San Diego or Fort Worth. Each factory made modifications and changes without coordinating with the others. Parts were not standardized. A replacement wing from one factory might not fit a fuselage from another. Maintenance crews in combat zones went insane, trying to keep these Frankensteined bombers flying. Some B-24s were so poorly built that they were falling apart before they even reached combat. Rivets popped loose. Hydraulic lines leaked from day one. Electrical systems failed constantly. And the engines, those cursed Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasps, were overworked and undermaintained. By 1943, B-24 bombers were deployed to every theater of the war. The 8th Air Force in England flew them alongside B-17 bombers on bombing raids over Germany. The 15th Air Force in Italy used them to hit targets in southern Europe and the Balkans. In the Pacific Theater, B-24s flew long-range missions against Japanese-held islands. And everywhere they went, B-24s died in horrifying numbers. The 8th Air Force lost 2,112 B-24 bombers in combat over Europe. That is more than 21,000 crewmen dead or missing. The loss rate was staggering. In 1943, before long-range fighter escorts became available, B-24 crews had a 25% chance of completing their required 25-mission tour. That means 3 out of 4 crews did not make it. The mission that defined the B-24's reputation was Ploesti. On August 1st, 1943, 177 B-24 bombers launched from Libya to bomb the oil refineries at Ploesti, Romania. It was the deepest penetration raid yet attempted, over 1,000 miles, from base to target and back. The B-24 was chosen because of its range. No other bomber could make the trip. The plan called for a low-altitude attack to achieve surprise. The B-24s would come in at treetop level, drop their bombs, and escape before German defenses could react. It was audacious. It was also a catastrophe. Everything went wrong. The formations got separated. The lead navigator made a wrong turn. Some groups attacked the wrong targets. The ones that found Ploesti ran straight into a meat grinder. The Germans knew they were coming. Flak batteries surrounded the refineries. Barrage balloons hung at low altitude, their cables ready to shred aircraft. The Romanian Air Force, equipped with German fighters, was waiting. The B-24s came in low and slow, making them perfect targets. Flak tore through them. Fighters shot them down. Some bombers flew so low they hit obstacles and crashed. Others were caught in explosions from their own bombs. The sky over Ploesti was filled with burning B-24s, men bailing out, aircraft cartwheeling into the ground. By the time the survivors limped back to Libya, 54 B-24 bombers were gone. That is 30% of the attacking force destroyed in one mission. Another 55 bombers were so badly damaged they never flew again. The raid did damage the refineries, but Romanian workers repaired them within weeks. The mission was later deemed a strategic failure. 5 medals of honor were awarded, the most ever for a single mission, because the bravery displayed was extraordinary. But the losses were unsustainable. The Ploesti raid proved that the B-24, for all its range and bomb capacity, could not survive in heavily defended airspace. The crews who flew B-24s over Europe faced the same hell as B-17 crews. Flak fields turned the sky black with explosions. German fighters made head-on attacks. Temperatures were so cold that frostbite was inevitable. Oxygen masks froze to faces. But B-24 crews had an added terror. They knew their aircraft was more likely to explode than the B-17s flying next to them. They knew that one good hit could blow the wing off. They knew that bailing out was a nightmare. So they flew anyway, day after day, mission after mission, watching their friends die, climbing back into the flying coffin because someone had to. The Pacific theater was different, but no less deadly. B-24s in the Pacific flew ultra-long-range missions over open ocean. They hunted Japanese shipping, bombed enemy airfields, and provided reconnaissance. The distances were staggering. Some missions lasted 14 hours or more. Engine failure over the Pacific meant ditching in the ocean and hoping the air-sea rescue found you before you died of exposure or sharks got you. Many B-24 crews ditched and were never found. Others made emergency landings on remote islands held by the Japanese and were captured or killed. The Pacific War was a war of attrition, and the B-24 was ground down mission by mission. One of the few advantages the B-24 had over the B-17 was bomb capacity. The B-24 could carry a heavier bomb load farther than the B-17. This made it useful for carpet bombing campaigns and for hitting targets the B-17 could not reach. But that extra bomb capacity came at a cost. A fully loaded B-24 was a pig to fly. It was slow, sluggish, and vulnerable. Pilots struggled to keep formation. Gunners had trouble tracking targets, and if you lost an engine on takeoff with a full load, you were probably dead. There are countless reports of B-24s crashing on takeoff, exploding, and killing everyone aboard because they were overloaded. The worst design flaw, the one that defined the B-24's reputation as a death trap, was the wing structure. The Davis wing was aerodynamically efficient, but it was not strong. Under combat stress, with battle damage and heavy loads, the wing could fail catastrophically. There are documented cases of B-24s breaking apart in midair during combat maneuvers. The wing would snap off, the fuselage would tumble, and the entire crew would die before they could bail out. It did not happen often, but it happened enough that crews were terrified of it. You could survive flak damage, you could survive fighter attacks, but if the wing failed, you were dead. Maintenance crews in combat zones hated the B-24. It required more maintenance hours per flight hour than the B-17. The systems were complex and unreliable. Parts were hard to find because of the lack of standardization between factories. Ground crews worked miracles keeping B-24s flying, patching battle damage, replacing engines, jury-rigging systems that had failed. But they could not fix the fundamental design flaws. They could not make the wing stronger. They could not make the fuel system safer. They could not make egress easier. So the B-24 kept killing crews. By late 1944, the war in Europe was winding down. Allied fighter escorts had achieved air superiority. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Bombing missions became less deadly. But even then, B-24s were still getting shot down, still exploding, still killing their crews. The statistics are grim. The 8th Air Force lost more B-24s than B-17s despite having fewer B-24 groups. The loss rate per sortie was higher for the B-24, the casualty rate was higher, and the survival rate for crews shot down in B-24s was lower because so few men could escape the aircraft before it exploded. After the war ended, the B-24 was retired almost immediately. The military could not get rid of them fast enough. Thousands were flown to scrap yards and cut apart for aluminum. Some were converted to transports or reconnaissance aircraft, but most were scrapped. Unlike the B-17, which remained in service for years and was beloved by veterans, the B-24 was forgotten. Museums preserved a handful, but compared to the 18,482 built, almost none survived. Today, only a couple are still airworthy. The B-24 does not get the glory or the recognition. It is overshadowed by the B-17 and the B-29. And maybe that is appropriate, because the B-24 was never beloved. It was tolerated. It was necessary, but it was not loved. The legacy of the B-24 Liberator is complicated by the sheer numbers. Yes, it was the most produced American bomber. Yes, it served in every theater. Yes, it dropped millions of tons of bombs on Axis targets. But it was also a fundamentally flawed design that killed thousands of the men who flew it. The B-24 was optimized for production and range at the expense of survivability and safety. The crews paid the price. The young men who climbed into B-24s knew they were flying a death trap. They did it anyway. That takes courage. But it does not change the fact that the aircraft was dangerous. Historians often praise the B-24 for its production numbers and its contribution to the war effort. And those things are true. Without the B-24, the strategic bombing campaign would have been slower and less effective. The B-24's range allowed missions that the B-17 could not fly. But we also need to acknowledge what the B-24 was. It was a mass-produced bomber built as quickly and cheaply as possible to meet wartime demand. Quality was sacrificed for quantity. Safety was sacrificed for speed. And young men died because of those decisions. The engineers who designed the B-24 were not incompetent. They made choices based on the requirements they were given. Long range, high bomb capacity, ease of production, those were the priorities. Survivability was secondary. The military accepted this trade-off because they needed bombers immediately. They could not wait for a perfect design. So they deployed a flawed aircraft and accepted the casualties as the cost of winning. That is the brutal calculus of total war. It worked. The Allies won. But the boys who burned alive in B-24s over Germany might have a different perspective. There is no monument to the B-24 crews. No national memorial. The aircraft itself is rarely celebrated. It exists in the shadow of more famous bombers, and perhaps that is fitting. The B-24 Liberator was never meant to be glorious. It was meant to be functional. It was meant to carry bombs, drop them, and hopefully bring the crew home. Sometimes it did. Often it did not. The crews who survived their tours in B-24s did not talk much about the aircraft after the war. They talked about their friends who died. They talked about missions gone wrong. But they rarely spoke fondly of the bomber itself. The final truth about the B-24 Liberator is this. It was the most produced American bomber because it was easy to build, not because it was good. It served in every theater because it had range, not because it was safe. It dropped millions of tons of bombs because there were thousands of them, not because each individual aircraft was effective. The B-24 was a weapon of mass production, a quantity over quality solution to the problem of strategic bombing. It worked, but it killed a lot of Americans in the process. The flying coffin, the flying brick, the Widowmaker. These were not nicknames given by people who hated the B-24. They were nicknames given by the men who flew it, the men who climbed into it day after day, knowing it might explode, knowing the wing might snap off, knowing they might not be able to bail out in time. They flew it anyway because that was their job. But they did not love it. They did not trust it. They survived it, or they died in it, but they never forgot what it was. This is the story of the B-24 Liberator, the most produced American bomber in history. A mass production miracle that employed hundreds of thousands of workers and helped win the war. And a fundamentally flawed death trap that killed thousands of the young men who were forced to fly it. Both things are true. Both deserve to be remembered. The glory of production numbers, the tragedy of structural failure and fuel fires and crews who could not escape. The B-24 helped liberate Europe, but for the boys inside when it exploded over Germany, there was no liberation, only death.